without any further ado, it's my great pleasure to welcome our final keynote speaker today, Dr. Frans Cronje. He needs very little introduction, I think, in the South African market to give us his scenario or ideas of where South Africa is heading. Which, if your name is Magnus, is probably a foregone conclusion. He is a former CEO of the Institute of Race Relations. He then was a director at the Center for Risk Analysis, and he currently heads up Frans Cronje Private Clients. And I'm not sure, Frans, if you've still got some great lamb on the go as well, but is probably one of the better lamb farmers in the country as well. So a warm round of applause, everyone, for Dr. Frans Cronje.
Thanks, Michael. Right, hello to everybody. What I've got to do, I'm going to talk for about half an hour, then we've got 15 minutes Q&A. I've been asked to talk about the broad economic outlook. I'm going to do that in the form of looking at Eskom and load shedding, and I'm going to tell you that load shedding is going to go away and disappear. And the second thing I'm going to do is look at the election next year. I'm going to show you some of the latest polls. We've got amazing numbers actually just back this morning, so you're going to be the first group to see those before they actually released in November. And I'm going to tell you what the coalition deals could be and what the implications are. And it's great to do this with Michael. You know, Michael and I have got a long history, and we had that amazing show at Classic FM like 15 years ago. You were there, and Clem Santer and Davy Root and so on. So Michael's very good at this stuff in his own right. So maybe you'll shoot a few holes in what I'm going to try and tell people. Let's start with the economic outlook, and let's start with Eskom. And as ever, before we go forward, it's useful to go back. It's 1990, all the way on the left of the chart, and that's 2022, late 2022 on the right, and you're looking at total production of electricity in the country, gigawatt hours through that period, and the two big things, that it was increasing pretty rapidly, particularly in the aftermath. There's the transition, the Asian financial crisis slows things down. 2004 to 2007, and the run-up to that, production reflecting consumption is taking off very quickly. What's happening behind the scenes is that the number of people with a job will double in that 10-year period, from around 8 million to around 14.5 million. And the reason for that is the economic growth rate will lift from these very low figures in the run-up to the transition and back to the late 80s and the late 70s, and we'll be, after the Asian crisis, doing 3 and 4, and then here, between 2004 and 7, the South African economy is averaging a growth rate of 5%. Does that for 4 consecutive years. The first time that had happened since the first half of the 1960s. As a consequence of that, the jobs numbers are up. At the same time, there's a rollout of the most expansive welfare program in any emerging market. Number of welfare recipients is up from about, let's start here, mid-90s, about 2 to 3 million, to about 12 or 13 million by the time that Mr. Mbeki is chased out of his office in the union buildings. And that's financed by a remarkable sort of period of macroeconomic and fiscal management that sees government debt levels as a share of GDP cut in half, and the saving on the government's interest bill finances the rollout of the welfare program. And it's an amazing era, and the ANC never gets credit for it. Even today, you still hear about jobless growth of the Mbeki era, which was nonsense, and service delivery that failed in the first 10 years, and it didn't, because in that 10 years, the ANC and government built 10 formal houses for every shack that was newly erected, and it rolls out the welfare, and it secures a budget surplus, and it gets growth to 5%. And on a per capita, the GDP basis, South Africans' earnings, as a share of the average of the world, eat into that global average, and we do really well. 2007, 8, 9, things start going wrong. Mr. Mbeki is booted at the Polokwane conference of the ANC. The policy inflection of the government turns against what he'd been accused of, the sort of Washington consensus neocon policy that brought about, these critics would have you believe, jobless growth and failed service delivery. We intersect that with a global financial crisis, We layer Jacob Zuma and the state capture era on top of it, and it's all pretty catastrophic. And in the subsequent 15 years to today, the net number of South Africans with a job is essentially still the same number that it was when Mr. Mbeki left his office. The share of South Africans living in a formal house, or let's do it the other way around, the share living in a shack has begun to rise again. And real per capita GDP has been falling for the better part of a decade. And you see electricity falling on the back of that. Now, these are little stepping stones. I'm going to try and pull these strings together for you as we go. Why was this happening on electricity specifically? And the answer lies in this chart over here. We'll show you a slightly shorter window, 2011 to 2023. The orange line is the energy availability factor. You read that off the left. It's what share of Eskom's plants are actually working and producing electricity. And that used to be about 80%, and it falls away because of corruption and mismanagement and all of that to bottom out at around 50%. And then there's a little intriguing flip in the line, which we're going to deal with. Why that was falling away was chiefly because of this, wonderfully named by some energy person somewhere, the unplanned outage factor, which is the stuff that broke down and we didn't know that it was going to. And that's the mismanagement of the Eskom plant and equipment. And that picks up from 6% to about 30%. And you can see that that's begun to turn around. In around the first quarter of this year, I started telling clients load shedding's over. And the reason I did that is that we came to understand that the cabinet was changing its strategic view of why we had a load shedding problem and what we needed to do to get out of it. And that view changing in the cabinet drew a lot of oxygen from charts similar to this. This is first quarter 2023, and that is the potential production infrastructure that Eskom chiefly possessed. So it could produce 45,000 megawatts of coal. That's what the infrastructure it had. It wasn't doing that. Could do a little bit of hydro, and the gas is the diesel that we run in the gas turbines, and then some solar and wind and the 2 reactors at Koeberg and imports. What was actually being produced looked like this. So coal was working at a third of its potential. Hydro and pump storage was fine, because you can't run 24/7, because you've got to pump the stuff up in the day and let it run down at night. The government, the Treasury and Eskom and various others were fighting about the price of diesel, so we weren't running the turbines. And the solar and wind was fine, and one of Koeberg's reactors is out for maintenance. And if you're a senior ANC official, or you sit in the cabinet, and you've just received some polling that shows you that 4 in 10 of your voters say if the lights are off at the time of the next election, I'm seriously reconsidering where I put that cross. You think, well, hell, the solution might just lie on the left of this chart, which is exactly what happened. Further buttressed by a number of things, including charts such as this. It's the provinces from the Eastern Cape through the Free State and all the way out to the Western Cape. And what I show you is surplus capacity on the country's electrical grid. So how much space was there in the sort of big power lines to carry new electricity that's produced from one place to another? And you see that the bulk of the surplus capacity, thousands of megawatts, 6 there in KZN and Mpumalanga the same, essentially suggests to you a band that runs from the north to the south, which is correct because that is the old grid built for the coal fields in the north, and then you run down out of Mpumalanga into KZN, into Gauteng, and into the Western Cape. Running from the west of the country to the east, from the zone of higher solar radiation into where electricity is consumed, there was nothing. And to take full advantage of a sort of green transition, we would have to build a new grid first, and I'm quite optimistic on the country's prospects, but if we first have to build a grid before we can do the green transition, I would be cautious about prospects for success of that. And the government therefore came to understood the coal fleet is vastly underperforming and the green transition just cannot work when you consider the scale of megawatts that need to be produced to knock a 30% unemployment rate down to levels that the ANC might one day politically survive. And the government therefore adopts a strategy that looks something like this. There are those production numbers, February 2023, the first quarter. Coal's doing about 16 or so of its 45, and the other bits and pieces are kind of doing what they can. And the decision becomes, let's try and do this, the intervention. Let's see if in 12 months we can get coal up by 3,000 megawatts. Now, 1,000 megawatts is one stage of load shedding, so you can do the maths. And we'll settle the dispute about the diesel price and solar and wind's coming along all on its own, and we'll get that reactor at Kuiberg running again. The result, at the end of it, see on the right, is that by mid-2024, production levels that in the first quarter of 2023 had, in the week that we did this, been about 23,000, rises to nearer 30,000. You shut out 7 stages of load shedding. We were at the time averaging about stage 5, sometimes 6. Load shedding's over. And we made the call on the basis we made the client call that this stuff, that load shedding's over, on the basis of our understanding of the changed approach in the cabinet, the accelerant for that, which was the departure of Mr. De Ruyter, who, whatever merits the man might have had, wanted to take advantage of the failing coal trend to justify a green transition that could never have occurred. And it's quite an optimistic take. On the 60 months view, 5 years, the intention of the electricity minister, with the support of much of the cabinet, is to try and pull this off. That's first quarter 2023 figures, which you're now familiar with. The intervention is to refit 1/3 of the coal fleet. Remember, the coal fleet's 45,000 megawatts. About a third was working. Refit a further third. The way you refit it, apparently, is engineers go and audit a coal plant. Doesn't matter how old it is. They say some of the oldest 50-year-old stuff is rock solid. Pull out the pieces inside that don't work, the pipes and valves and other related things. Order those parts from the original manufacturer or make them. Put them back in again, and there's one Eskom chap who doesn't wish to be quoted on this said, light it up and it's going to work. It's not going to be pretty. It's going to be the most polluting power plants anywhere in the world, but it's going to work. And we're going to produce, as a consequence, potentially take production, if you take it the other interventions, take production up to around 45,000 megawatts within 5 years from the 24,000. And these are astonishing figures. What does that mean? We tried to estimate that. So we said for South Africa to again aspire from an energy perspective to a growth rate of 5%, which you'll recall I told you is what we were doing in the mid-2000s and produced such amazing social and economic successes. How much electricity does the country need? So we looked at historical trends in other countries and how growth relates to energy consumption and how technological interventions make consumption more efficient. We did all of that. Our low estimate was that if South Africa was a high-skilled economy, excellent maths results in high school, we'd probably need to go to about 36,000 megawatts. We draw lots of kids into the services economy. You need less megawatts of electricity per point of growth in services. The high estimate, more realistic, is we need to go to 45 over a 10-year period. Wouldn't say which year. You never know when government starts these things. But this is over a 10-year period, off the first quarter figure of 24. So my first point, my opening point for you, I'll make 2 points today, is in your own economic estimates and outlooks, factor some of this stuff in. There's a whole world of policy reform that needs to follow this to get the growth rate back to 5%. This on its own doesn't do it. But the call that electricity necessarily in and of itself caps South Africa's economic potential is a call that I would challenge. Estimates, what does that mean? Without the other policy reforms, this from 94 is GDP growth. It doesn't look very impressive, but you guys understand these charts all because of this craziness around COVID. Consensus view now, perhaps we're headed for growth rate of 1.5%. If our energy call proves correct, in and of itself, we'd say the country can aspire to something nearer 2 without any other policy reform, privatizing railways and ports and all these things that need to happen at the same time. So that's the economics. Let's look at the politics. 94 to 2023. Initially, we have intervals of 5 years to 2019. That's because these are going to be the first 6 elections. Then we'll have 2021 with an asterisk, but it's a local government election. Can't compare it to a national election, but you can actually. Here, we can look at it and see what it tells us. And then polls, mostly conducted by a group I happen to chair, a small polling outfit, the Social Research Foundation. It produces the bulk of the numbers you're going to see there. So let's start with the ANC. They're in gold. The names disappeared from next to their little block. They also, a few years ago, lost control of their website. You'll see now it's ANC 1912. It used to be ANC. And that was because of a dispute with a web developer over payment. So they've lost their little name on my chart as well. A remarkable thing happens in that first 10 years that I told you they did so well. Because under Mr. Mandela, they were at 63, and a decade later, they were at 70. And the reason is that life was getting so much better for so many South Africans, and there's no liberation loyalty voting in South Africa. It doesn't exist. It's very much a secondary factor that's allowed to influence the views of voters after they've realized that their lives are improving. In the absence of improving life, liberation loyalty counts for 0. We do more research into voter perceptions and opinion than anyone else. And the ANC does wonderfully. And under Mr. Mbeki, mind you, who they cast out into the wilderness, chase away, so he's terrible neocon. Under Mr. Ramaphosa, 2019, they're down to 58. 2021, they're at 46. It's a local government election, but psychologically, that's a hell of a thing. Because now you're thinking, when I can remember Michael and I, when we still did that show thing, out here, if we told people who governed South Africa after the ANC, they wouldn't have understood why we made it. It's impossible. Of course, the ANC governs South Africa. This really changes that. Last year, we had them, margin of error on this stuff's around 2%. So we had them clinging by their fingernails to 50 on a national. And they could get there. In the media, you might have seen figures, the ANC's at 30 and so on. Those numbers that 30 numbers just doesn't exist. It's someone's information campaign somewhere that I tried to run down and got halfway to finding out what that was about. But be very wary what you read in the mainstream on some of this stuff. You want to see the source, the margin of error, the sample size, all of that. Otherwise, you're in another world. This year we had them, remember the coalition in Gauteng starts fighting terribly with itself around about here. And we see that has this moonshot idea. When the moonshot partners fight each other to the death, the flow out of the ANC slows down. When the moonshot partners stop trying to destroy each other, wary of the camera, otherwise I'll tell you more, the flow out of the ANC picks up again. So we had them at 51, 52, 51. This stuff came in for me at 10 o'clock this morning, 45. It's the first time that on a real stretch, even with margin of error, we can't put them above 50% on a national. These things change over time, change again. You're the first, we'll release the stuff in November, so you're the first to see it. There's the DA. It had a bit of a setback in 2019. John took it back to the mid-20s. That's a hell of a strong number today. These things, you must understand, political perception moves in a wave-like pattern, literally in 24-hour cycles, based on what happens to people. So if you've been paid at the end of the month, and the Springboks have done well in the rugby, and there are no terrible scandals of corruption around, then support for the ANC can be up 2 or 3, 4 points. The weather, everything, otherwise it's down. So we've hit the ANC on a low, we've hit the DA on a high. The EFF tend to be stuck at around 10. And we're comfortable that we understand why, and we've tested EFF voters' opinion. And the real trouble for the EFF is that its motivating emotion is, Reagan's strategist said, you convince with reason, you motivate with emotion. The motivating emotion is violence and anarchy, and I'll show you that in party perception numbers just now. And that's not a sustainable emotion. Hope is a sustainable emotion, a better future, working together, all these old sort of slightly soft cliches. So the EFF's pinned, perhaps it's at a ceiling now of 12 or 13 on a good day, and they're the other partners as well. So where I was telling clients, look, on the present data, the ANC probably just clings to national majority next year. Not sure what to tell you about this morning. But I can tell you about this with certainty. Let's change the way we think about the politics. Only the urban people are going to vote in one election, and the rural people are going to vote in a different election, and what are the results? In that urban election, the ANC would now get 33%. In a rural election, 65%. The DA and in both, and then the EFF. About 10 years ago already, the ANC lost the aspirant, younger, urban voting market. If you have a job in that, let's say we only have employed people voting against unemployed people, the ANC loses amongst the employed. Amongst university graduates, it gets about 20%. If you own an asset, anything, it's a modest thing, ANC is under 50 in that constituency. So it's surrendered irrevocably, never to get it back. The future South African voting market. And it's held to its 50% by an aging rural market, which makes complete sense, because these are older people who are poorer, who are black, who grew up in rural South Africa under apartheid, which was really, really harsh. And that frame of reference keeps ANC support levels at that rate. For younger people, the perspective is totally different. And therefore, the criticism of the ANC is so much greater. Go to the battleground provinces in Gauteng. We've had the ANC. I must tell you, show you how the waves work. We've had them at 30. The most recent Gauteng look, we had them at 40, which was a strong ANC performance. The DA's even in some polls been neck and neck with the ANC in Gauteng. In the Western Cape, the DA is consolidating. Coloured nationalist voting, which I thought would eat into the DA support base, turns out is not doing so. And in fact, the Western Cape ballot splits, with coloured Western Cape voters voting very strongly for the DA in the Western Cape, but on the national ballot, taking a chance on the very, these are very, Gayton McKenzie's a hell of a capable guy, taking a gambit on him and the rest of the country, seeing how he does. There's the EFF and these, in KZN, ANC's at 40. Now, we did that before and post the death of Buthelezi. They're going to lose Gauteng, they're going to lose KZN. And put yourselves in the position. This is what you see on the IEC results board after the election next year. You're the party leaders. What deals are you going to make on the basis of this? And to think deeply about that. Put yourself in that position. That lazy analysts say, well, obviously the ANC works with the EFF because they're all exactly the same. But if you're an ANC strategist, those EFF guys are super sharp. They're ferocious. They're going to eat you up and chew you up and spit you out, probably put you on trial for corruption if you're not careful, in front of a tribunal in a soccer stadium. It's a horrific thought. And if the shock that the EFF-ANC deal causes to the country's economy for a period accelerates the living standards trends that have caused ANC support to collapse, and there's some super sharp opposition strategists out there who say maybe this is the best option, As long as we go to a free election in 2029, by that time, the ANC-EFF collective is at 30%. And the centrist opposition core that's being built is in a majority. So you can ask me some questions about the coalitions. And in Natal, the same thing is going to happen. For the ANC, and this is understood, inside, fail to govern in Gauteng and fail to govern in KZN, and you become a regional party centered in the north of the country with a rural support base of aging people. And there's no way back from that for you again to get into what the future voting market will be. Sort of destruction of the democracy, which is very difficult to do. There's the IFP, which has had a hell of a spurt after the focus brought to it as a consequence of the death of Buthelezi. What if Mr. Ramaphosa leaves? He'll go one day. He's very popular broadly in the ANC. He's much more popular than his party. And that's why ANC strategists ran campaigns called CR17 and Vote for Cyril. Because had they run Vote for the ANC, they could have lost the election in 2019 already, and they knew it. And he's way up on them. But he does leave one day. I remember an attorney I used to know said that his client said that if I die, and he said, no. He said, when you die, this is what happens to you. So we tested this vividly. We created a picture for voters. We said, imagine Mr. Ramaphosa is fighting gallantly for everything that's good. And he tries so hard, but it's a bit of a kind of Hollywood version of reality. And these dastardly kind of RET people sabotage him, and he's chased away from the ANC. He's not there anymore. Imagine that's happened. And we present you with a ballot paper. How do you vote? And this is the result of the subsequent election. The ANC is now at 35. The DA's gone up to just below that. The EFF's gone up to 16, and the others are there. That is what our parliament will look like by the end of this decade. Not exactly the numbers, but the structure. But this is the structure of all similar political systems. The Bundestag, the Knesset in Israel. The biggest players have a third of the vote. And then there's someone else that might have 20. And then there are all sorts of little rats and mice parties that make up the difference. And the people who govern the society are those who are the best deal makers, not the biggest players. And when you make those deals, if you make really bad deals that cause the economy to perform poorly, you must never not believe a word of the idea that our political system doesn't work. It works very well. On a bit of a lag time, when the economy performs well, whoever's in charge does really well politically. When performance starts to suck, there's, on a bit of a lag time, an immediate political and severe political consequence. So even if you make the ANC-EFF deal, I think the odds are that the ANC-EFF get defeated 5 years later, not that the country fails entirely, never to recover. A little insight on why I think that. We test a lot of what do voters think and so on, and they're very pragmatic. So this is a word association exercise. You say to voters, we're going to put some words, a phrase to you, and forget who you vote for. It's not important. Or who you like or don't like, or who you think is corrupt or racist. Or just tell us, when you saw the word, which of the parties did you think of? So we'll start at the bottom. Best at service delivery. A third of voters said, we just thought of the ANC. The DA got a slightly bigger third, it's neck and neck. The EFF got 10. Which party breaks its promises to you? The ANC got 75. The DA got a little bit, and the EFF got less, which is correct. The EFF guys are honest. What they do, one message, never changes. This is what we're going to do, time and again. Which party is violent? The ANC not so much, the DA less, and the EFF comes out there, and you don't vote for that. You might like it in the stadium, sounds good, you're pissed off, your life sucks, you went to a rubbish school, you don't have a job, it's this revolutionary stuff works in that environment, but do you vote for it? A lesson we put some of the politicians who sometimes traipse around and come and ask for advice is the story of the flowers. Do you like flowers? And they sort of eventually say they do. And we say, do you buy them? And they say they don't. And the EFF is a very similar kind of an idea. ANC voters, if you're an ANC strategist, you've done very badly. But it's put to ANC voters. This is only ANC voters. Now, imagine, the country changes and the ANC, for various reasons, needs to start making some harsh decisions. If it makes these decisions, merit hiring alone in the civil service, so we were looking for the hottest, most controversial, divisive issues. No, not should we be nice and have more jobs. Scrap the minimum wage, do away with it, or join a coalition. In other words, surrender the idea of its dominant majority. Would you support them if they did that or didn't? Support for merit in the civil service is 65%. For scrapping the minimum wage is 50%. And that's amazing, because these are major ideological victories over the apartheid system and the era of white domination. These are core victories, core ideological victories, emotional victories. That an at all significant share of the ANC voter base is, under some circumstances, willing to surrender those shows how much further public opinion has advanced in the country and how far ahead of its political and business leaders it is on a number of questions. And would you join a coalition? That's there's a related question we ask, which is that if you got to the ballot box, you looked, and your party wasn't there, what would you do? Now, it's similar to me getting home and my beloved saying to me, if she wasn't around anymore, have I ever given any thought to... If I said, yes, I actually, Sue's very lekker, I thought that... You mustn't answer like that. And the same applies to a political party. If you say, who would you vote for? Your party wasn't there. The correct answer, if you've run your party well, is I don't know, because I never thought about it. That's the answer for the husbands in this room as well, by the way. And only 1 in 3 ANC voters say they don't know who they'd vote for. Now, I can tell you, 20 years ago, they wouldn't have thought the question meant much at all. And there's the don't knows. Last point I want to make for you on this is that for all the flack the government gets on Russia, they're not as pro-Russia as they make themselves appear to be. And you can ask me some questions on that. We could talk about AGOA a little bit if we have time. There's a hell of a pragmatic streak that continues to run through the ANC that makes it salvageable as a future coalition partner. This is the budget deficit over 100 years, 110, from the early days of the formation of the Union. There's the First World War, the Second World War, and the pain of this deficit instrumental to Smuts' defeat in 1948. There is, where is that, 85, Pierre Botha, and his Rubicon speech, concurrent with Chase Manhattan's decision not to roll over South Africa's debt. Deficits bring about changes in government, because you've run out of money to meet the expectations of your supporters. They're at early. This is ANC fiscal pragmatism. Look at that, what they did on the deficit this time. It related, of course, to what I told you earlier about debt. And they did that for not just because they're nice people, but because of an early Mandela lesson that the Nats had screwed up so badly in the country's economy that if we do not grow it, we will be borrowing from the IMF within a few short years. And that means our revolution is over, because there'll be a veto on the budget speech. We'll run it by Washington to ask whether we are allowed to say these things. And that is law that runs inside a streak of the ANC. You do not borrow in dollars, because those Westerners will get you. And that was abandoned to some extent through the Zuma era. Under the now facing defeat in an election, the minister knows, what a kind of half-baked Soviet-inspired liberation movement should do is print a lot of money. Because you want to create inflation now. Inflation will create desperation, which will create populism. You can harness the populism to evade a political defeat. They are doing exactly, they know this stuff. They're good revolutionary strategists. He's trying to rein in debt, and he's trying to rein in the deficit, and off the right-hand axis, there's debt to GDP the first 15 years and thereafter. He's trying to rein it in. Very few analysts see how important this is and what it says about, beyond some of the fracture stuff, that there's this core of fiscal pragmatism. Makes us completely unique amongst many emerging markets with liberation-era governments that face the political crunch that the ANC is in at the moment. And my suggestion to you on the politics is that it's plausible that things play out in a way that the ANC and the DA find each other. They might initially not, They find each other. You think you're in that position, you're going to strike a deal. You're going to bring these EFF guys in as your partners, facing the consequences. If you're the DA chaps, and I don't want to talk about the smaller parties, but some of them are quite a handful with their 1%. They want 30% of the seats on the council, and they must be the mayor, and this and this. And the ANC DA guys, if you understand what this says about some of the thinking in the ANC, are not as far away from each other on many questions as it seems. And if we get the electricity thing right, and if that deal is pulled off, then we're actually not at a point of inevitable collapse, but we're more likely at a sort of early 90s point of unexpected success. Because it's not just that we pull the political transition off, but the economic recovery after it. And in your thinking about the future, you do well to dwell on this prospect as you filter through the otherwise waves of analyst comment that we are doomed to fall off the sort of cliff. And Michael, that's the end from me. Thank you very much.
Frans, please take a seat. So if I could just kick us off, Frans, on that issue around what a future coalition might look like. And I was having lunch with Moletti and Becky a couple of weeks ago, who begs to differ on the important point you make about whether or not the ANC would do a deal with the DA. And he says it's far more likely to see an ANC-EFF coalition. And his reasoning being that the DA wouldn't want to risk hitching its wagon to certain failed policies that the ANC would still, as a majority partner in a coalition, be pushing around those reforms that we need to see in the economy, around labour, around opening up to the private sector and key network industries. And so would rather than continue to play the role of opposition and allow the inevitable failure to take place and therefore not damage its brand. How do you respond to that?
Let's talk in theoretical terms. You can read between the lines. That view is taken seriously on the opposition side, because there is merit in the strategy of saying, box the ANC, EFF in together. It's the best thing that can happen. I don't buy the idea the country is going to fall apart in the next 5 years because of the consequences. It's a very, very tough society, this. In some respects, if you think broadly, the territory of the modern South Africa is that the country is today, over the last 400 years, has been a history of violence and poor economic management and oppression and the like. And for that 400 years, it was arguably only governed well for 15, which was the 90s, late 90s to 2007 and 8. And yet here we all sit today. And I remember we used to be quite out there in some of our calls on that show, which is why I liked it so much. If we'd said to people, listen, what's in store for you? Firstly, the country will run out of electricity, and the lights will be off at times for 12 hours a day. There'll be a plague. The whole place will be shut down. You'll be locked in your house. And if you live in Natal, there'll be a violent insurrection that causes you to take the streets with your shotgun that you use for guinea fowl to stage a roadblock. These things will all happen to us. There'll be massive poverty. The looting will take place. Firstly, people were told you it can't happen. And secondly, they said if it did, it wouldn't exist anymore. No society can survive that. It survived it very much intact, given what what the alternative would be. So I don't buy the idea that 5 years of ANC EFF means that there's some sort of precipice. You go to the next election, our political system is very strong, it works very well. The political consequences for that 5 years will bring a centrist coalition government to power. On the other hand, I'm wary, I don't like the idea of now that the ANC is weak, you grind it into the dust and you destroy it. Chase it away, cast it out. And the reason for that is it has a very impressive track record on some core elements of government. And I am obviously aware that statement is a strong one. The core fiscal pragmatism still runs through it. Even at an ANC at 40%, it contains the hopes, aspirations, trusts, the dismay of millions of voters. And I think it would be to cast the ANC out of government would set in motion perhaps future cycles of recrimination for which we will all pay a heavy price. And that the sensible thing to do might be to try and actually use this moment to cross another one of South Africa's many Rubicons, the many to come. It's a volatile, we're just a volatile emerging market like all the others. There'll be more, the horrors to come, but we'll survive them. I think that makes a lot of sense too. So I think both strategies work, and in the end, for the country, both strategies work. You do a deal with the ANC. If you can't do that, you pension it off, and it has its last policy conference under a thorn tree on the Botswana border in its headquarters, and that's the end. The interesting thing from if you go through this sort of chess game is that more often than not, in the longer term, South Africa comes out, in a sense, kind of on top. It's never vastly successful. It's never the sort of Singapore of Dubai of Africa or something. But it's a Smuts comment. He said South Africa is an interesting place because it never meets with the triumph or disaster. And that's been true since he said it, and I think it's going to remain true.
And De Kivit always says we tend to advance through either economic windfall or political disaster as well.
Exactly.
Yes. Anton, given what Frans has just painted in terms of a scenario and a picture, what are your thoughts? What are your questions?
I was interested to see the load shedding conclusions, very positive, obviously, for all of us. And when we had an interview a few months back after Eskom released that report around there, and the surveys around renewables, if you remember.
But we arrived at it through a different...
Exactly. That's exactly the question I was going to ask. It was a very different conclusion because the projects and developments on renewables is substantial and the gap gets very much closed by 2025. I know you made the point around transmission. But I guess just two questions. Firstly, why do you feel that the gap isn't closed through renewables, and linked to that, why are you so much more you mentioned it was a political focus, but political focus and action sometimes don't lead to the same thing. Why do you think that kind of coal investment in getting the plants more efficient, more up and running over the next few years, because in a sense that's what you're saying is the variable, right?
Well, the grid firstly can't carry a green transition. It's impossible. Just stops dead right there. So it doesn't work. It works in other areas, small areas. Where I live is plastered in solar panels, and it's amazing. It's wonderful. It's at a small scale, small businesses, your home, all of that's great. Maybe some kinds of businesses can do it. I've got clients who've done amazing things with solar. So I'm not opposed to it. There's a moral question that 20 to 30 million people who frankly, it can go as high as 30. It's modestly 20 million people who should have a job don't have one. And when I'm abroad and you confront the greenies, you say, how can you say South Africa should have coal? You're going to kill the world. I said to them, you must be very careful about that in our case, because you condemn 20 million people to a life of dire poverty when you say that. And if you're a national security person in Europe or America, the consequence is South Africa gets a radical populist government at the end of that, and therefore it becomes a Russian proxy state. and China gets a lease on the naval base at Simonstown. So you don't really want these results. And that it's unfair further to say that the South African government, in going back to the refitment of coal, which you haven't said, of course, it's not banking on a long-term coal future. The restoration of coal, because the plants stand there, is a short-term, 20-year, and these things, 20 years is short-term holding position, while we do an orderly transition to whatever green and nuclear, to my mind, the green technology we need in order to have a successful future. So there shouldn't be a conflict between what the ANC and government's trying to do on coal now and the green long-term ambitions of much of the rest of the world. And European and American policymakers who threaten our exports as a consequence are behaving in a way that reflects the worst of colonial excesses, and should be very careful that they aren't allowing their ideological predispositions to cause them to commit an actual very unfortunate set of consequences.
Frans, you're not writing Gwede Mantashe's speeches at the moment, are you?
I think he is right on almost everything that he says. What inspires that, and in the background, I can't go into. So if you have questions about virtue, fine. But he's right.
I've got 2 points to make quickly. The Meridian research produced by Cronje shows empirically that the build-out of new renewable independent power producer projects are not only more cost-effective on a per kilowatt basis than coal, but create more jobs in a rolling build-out phase. Because when we think of building out new solar, new wind, yes, the ideal location is in areas that are grid constrained, but Seriti Resources is now investing in wind farms in Mpumalanga because it's got grid access and capacity there, and that is a long, continual capex rollout strategy that is going to absorb workforce as it goes. So this idea that we've got to put one versus the other, I agree with you there. It should happen. The transition should happen, but I'm very concerned when it's pitted as a form of colonialism.
Let's talk numbers. We're at 24,000 to, from an energy perspective, grow the country at the rate we need to reduce the unemployment rate to under 10% over 20 years. We need the next decade 24,000 megawatt production number in a peak hour to become 45,000. Given the capacity factors of green, which, I mean, a refurbished coal plant does about 75% capacity factor, green, depending on the wind and sun, 2025. That means installing 60 to 80,000 megawatts of green capacity. A lot of that capacity will be available only at certain peak points of the day, and we'll have to run through those lines. It doesn't work. And not on Cronje, who are very good people and all of that, but this modeling stuff, a good comment on modeling, it's the subjective assumptions of the authors dressed up as elegant mathematics. Beyond that, there's well, you guys in this game, I suppose.
Weapons of mass destruction, yeah.
I apologize. The point, though, is that it's just plain common sense that if you've got 30,000 megawatts of coal stations standing in the veld and a power lines attached to them, and you can fix the thing in 3 years for very little money, that is going to do a lot of good to the economy. It's going to do a lot of good for jobs. And if we were a country that was already maintaining quite high growth rates, and we didn't have a major unemployment problem, and we didn't have the risk of radical populism or becoming a Russian proxy state and all of those things, I'm entirely with the transition. I just think for South Africa, focusing too narrowly on that transition now will bring about unintended social and political consequences that we will regret.
I mean, I'm going to just say one last thing, just talking about stats and data. I mean, in that Eskom survey, there's 66,000 megawatts worth of projects in various stages of development, from very early stage to very advanced stages. So actually it does tie quite nicely with your number. And then the thing which we haven't talked about, which I know is actually quite contentious, is the funding availability for renewables. And I know that there is obviously a lot of a lack of development we've seen in the $8 billion program. But I guess just in terms of what do you think the politics looks like in terms of how we think about funding what we need to do over the next few years?
Look,
That's a critical point.
I think on renewables, to kind of qualify a bit what I've said, because I'm also trying to help you, just push you to think a bit, is there should be absolutely no constraints on what any private provider wishes to do with renewables. If they wish to build grid, if they wish to build the plant, if they wish to sell it to a local municipality, go for it. If you say it works, prove me wrong. Go and do it. It's all there to do. You can raise a lot of generous funding from whichever ESG bit wants to do that for you. But a lot of that on the funding of coal, the South African foreign policy position needs to improve. That's why the moral argument's important, because it works in the West. I mean, I've seen it work, personally seen it work, to say that there is a moral problem on South Africa now, pushing it in this. Not that we don't get there, we will get there. But at this window, a lot of people suffer if you don't refit that coal stuff as quickly as possible. And therefore, I think South Africa should be exempted from whatever punitive measures the Europeans and the Americans wish to inflict on countries that don't, frankly, comply with their external edicts of how you as an emerging market or an African country are allowed to govern yourself. We don't tell the Americans how to do it.
There, I certainly agree with you. I think there's a lot of debate around using the carbon border adjustment mechanism as a new green tariff. The Inflation Reduction Act is very inward-looking and smacks of Smoot-Hawley, and there are talks of capital charges now coming down the line for banks who lend to fossil fuel companies. Now, this has got to be, from a political perspective, managed, I think, by many actors in the global south as we head up to the various COPs, where we've seen no money forthcoming in terms of loss and damage and other commitments made by the major polluters of the world. But I just want to end off maybe with a question or two from the audience. And I see there's nothing coming through on Slido again, so maybe we might just throw a mic around. Let's be bold. Is that time up? Oh, it can't be. Okay, should we do one more round of questions, and then we'll go into lunch. I see we've got a hand raised right at the back there, so maybe we could just get a mic to the gentleman. Please introduce yourself and please refrain from polemics questions.
I'm Tian Fourie. Frans, you mentioned the specific era around the high growth in the mid-2000s, and you claim that it comes from good governance. Could there be another driver like the commodity cycle, for instance? Because perhaps that is the driver, and because the commodity cycle has been in decline for 10 years, perhaps that explains why the ANC sucked for 10 years?
My point wasn't it came exclusively from good governance. It came from the good fortune of this. Cheap surplus electricity, lots of it, because the previous administration had built in the 70s and 80s for the growth rates of the 60s that never materialized. Secondly, interest rates coming in out of the transition were still above 20%, and they were cut in half off the back of really low household debt levels. And that spurred a consumption boom that was then complemented by the commodity boom. So there you have it. It's not just that, it's a lot of good fortune. However, in addition to that, there was incredibly shrewd macroeconomic management and the kind of destructive policy making that we would later see, and corruption. Well, some of it was emerging already, but it wasn't as much in play. And I think when you judge the performance of any government, but one of the ways you can judge it is did it position itself to take advantage of the good fortune and mitigate the bad fortune? And in the first half of after 94, we took advantage of our good fortune. We could have done much better than we did. Could have grown 6%. In the second half, we exacerbated the bad fortune as much as we possibly could. And that's why we got to this low point. So, yes, I agree with you completely, but I would add that the ANC deserves credit. It did a lot to raise the basic living standards of people after 1994. And that secured the stability. That was the democratic dividend that explains still why today, when we talk about how the country can change, we're talking about how it happens at an election. Many other parts of the world, you think of some immediately, that is not an option. And we have the good fortune of being in the minority of emerging markets who get into deep economic trouble and have the potential, the likelihood, the probability of changing through a relatively peaceful if chaotic process. And that's further one of our assets. Tiaan, thank you.
Thanks, Tiaan. Mike, and then the gent behind you, if we could just swing a mic around. Oh, thanks, Anton.
Mike Brown, just looking ahead, not looking back at the past, you say the ANC gets, say, 45%, okay? And there's a coalition situation in 2024. Does this have to be EFF? Does this have to be DA? Because there's 15% other, and I mean that other is a big number, but there must be opportunists out there. They don't have to be called Mackenzie or Mashaba or Mamani and all the rest, but they would do a deal, I would think, with the ANC to take them over that 50% line. I mean, what's your view on that?
Mashaba wouldn't. And he had a good initial run. He got hammered over the last 12 months, way down. The maths, Mike's really complicated because now you sit there. Now you're 45 nationally. So, okay, we're going to make a deal with the EFF. But the EFF and the ANC don't have 50% in Gauteng. So the opposition says, well, if you do that, we take Gauteng away from you. Now you're not governing in Gauteng. That's fatal. In KZN, you can't do a deal with the EFF to begin with because it doesn't get you to where you want. It's hugely unpopular in IFP circles. And there's a big blowback after Zuma's departure from the scene of Zulu nationalist vote into the IFP. And those IFP guys are good strategists. It's a sharp ex-co team. They could really take advantage of this. And the complex, I'll tell you, the complexities of how you strike these deals is only now beginning to dawn on the people who will strike them. And I've seen meetings where it's obvious that the people who will make those deals don't know what to do. And that's where they are at the moment. It's that open in the air because the realities of it are starting to dawn on them. So they don't know. So it's very, in that case, it's quite hard. And I understand what they don't know because I don't really know what the right one would be. So it's too early. Put all of them in play, but if you make the wrong ones, don't think that's now the country's collapsing, because the political system here works better than people realize. Govern badly, you lose support in the subsequent elections. And the faster that starts to happen, the faster parties that govern badly will begin to lose support. So even if the wrong deals are made, you still get to a point where ultimately it's plausible that takes you to the better one. If you make the better deal now, might be surprised if I'm right on the electricity stuff and the Europeans, Americans back off. And I'm not hostile to you. I'm wearing my American socks today as well. I just think they're going to lose in Africa if they carry on like they are. So, Mike, they don't know what deals they're going to make yet. Even if they wander for a time into the wrong ones, still if you play that out, they get back to the better ones. So my call for you is don't write off the prospects of the better deals being made.
The buffalo stumbles on. Next question, please.
Philip, interestingly, we've talked about the ANC 45%. You haven't actually covered the two factions within the ANC and how that might affect a deal after the next election. Do you see that happening, or do you see them going in as a complete party?
I think the two-faction thing has some analytical merit, but I think it's generally overdone. I don't think the factions are as clear and at odds with each other always as that. It's not a neat two-camp divide, which complicates, of course, the answer to Mike, because there are different views. Let me stop there, because I don't know whether what one learns is actually accurate. So I don't want to go into who said who's going to make a deal with whom. But I think the two-camp thing is slightly overblown. and the idea that there is a good camp, and then there's a bad one, I don't think in reality that's the case. I think they're two pretty bad camps. And that's where, with exceptions when it comes to certain individuals. But you can work with that. That's not different to other emerging markets. It's just that our perspective is off as a country. You know, this doesn't make us many societies have bad camps, and that you make hard deals, and you are motivated by what causes you not to lose power again, and your society moves forward. You must abandon this idea. You need to have nice people who you invite to dinner to govern your country. Otherwise, it's a failure. Governing is hard, and it's a game for tough, ruthless people. The great reformers, Park, Lee Kuan Yew, Deng, these weren't just nice people. And they could make the hard call. So I'm not worried about the fact that there are some rough camps around. The game is you force a balance of power and you make the best deal that you can. And you can do that with tough people.
Thanks, Frans. I think on that point, we're going to take all of the comments and questions into the lunchtime break. And I'm going to hand over to Anton just to wrap up and grab his mic there. And I certainly want to pick your brain a little bit more about how likely the ANC is to repudiate some of its policy stances in key areas. I think for business, that's important to understand and know. But we'll leave that there. Frans Cronje, everyone, a warm round of applause.
Thanks, Frans. That was fantastic. And thank you, everyone, for a great day. There is lunch, and we've got a session after lunch with Ashani on employee benefits. So hopefully most of you can join. Michael, thank you very much for hosting us today. It was, I'm biased, but I think it was a great day. We try to make this as kind of conversational and open as we could. So hopefully we've hit the right spot there. But thanks to all of you. In particular, thank you to Michelle and Prishka for doing such a great job in putting this together. So thank you.